Welcome back, attractive and well-educated watchers, to yet another episode of the Third Odyssey. This one a very special one. Last video was the main update that brought us to 1600 CE, but it was just too long, even though we need to cover some things that will become relevant to the next video, if we get enough likes. A huge part of Third Odyssey 2 was a continued and even more vested interest in the exploration of the Pacific and the spread of Elysian values across the waves into the distant lands of Asia. While you can certainly see little Elysian colonies on the map, we never did venture into what they mean, and today we're going to dedicate our video to all of that and more. While it will go a touch beyond the scope of last video, for the most part, this video will focus on the time between 1570 and 1610, when the Elysian advance into Asia is really just starting up. If Third Odyssey 2 gets 250 likes, we'll release Third Odyssey 4, and that will extend well into the 17th century. Until then, please enjoy this supplementary episode, which we'll call Third Odyssey 3 Edo Drift. You know, because it's not Tokyo yet. But before we get to that, of course, we need to talk about some extremely important details and potential questions you might all have for the last episode. First and foremost, let's get through the ugly subject of the syphilis problem. This would have been a problem since the arrival of the Elysians in the New World, and, of course, the successors to the Romans would have learned about it quite quickly, as it only takes a couple years to start drilling literal tunnels through your body, and not long thereafter drilling literal holes into your brain. Of all the diseases that strike the natives and go on to wipe them out wherever the Elysians go, a series of generational plagues that the Elysians seem utterly immune to, syphilis is the one that goes after the Old Worlders. And believe us, syphilis is something you don't want to get. We're not going to show any pictures here, but suffice to say we also don't recommend you go look them up, even on your own time. It's not a pretty sight, don't do it. And, considering it's not a pretty sight, alongside the whole high Elysian hygiene and medicinal traditions that were really just starting to take off at the time, it would be noticed, and it would be brought up before the Elysians even got properly settled into the Americas. Something had to be done, and something had to be done fast, lest this horrific contagion spread to the rest of society and go completely out of control. So, the Elysians, understanding the idea of quarantine already, enacted something along the lines of quarantine in perpetuo. Anyone discovered with syphilis, or who was found connected to syphilitics, was sent to a system of permanent quarantine colonies, not unlike leper colonies in the Old World, but more stringently maintained and more feverishly monitored. The overwhelmingly present academic culture of the Empire maintains a strict record of exactly when, where, and how often syphilis pops up as the Elysians expand across the continent. Indigenous tribes found to be inundated with syphilis are exterminated entirely. While perhaps one of the cruelest and most brutal health regimes in human history, over 150 years later, with the entirety of the American continents under Elysian control, syphilis has been driven extinct the old-fashioned way, hunted out of existence. It, like all of its victims, has ultimately died off in isolated communities, surrounded by walls and guards who only let people in and never let people out. Guards who themselves have willingly volunteered to never leave these tainted Bacchanalian colonies. By the year 1598, the last interitus colonea sit empty, and the last new case of syphilis was recorded some 30 years ago. The disease is no more. Having never spread to the Old World, and having only left a dark memory on the Elysian people, now that they've successfully quarantined the ailment into total eradication. Over the course of the next century, a few tiny outbreaks might manage to flare up, but by the early 1600s, a new swarm of discoveries in medicine, as well as certain adoption from the Ottomans, have led to the development of circumstances that make the old quarantine systems of the past seem quaint and naive. Various molds and plant oils had been used to treat infections and sores since the early Romans, and they've since incorporated so many more substances from the New World. But now, with a large-scale vat fermentation method to produce more of these substances in larger quantities and render them down properly, A new development peeks over the horizon. Without really understanding quite what they were doing, the medics working on these great vats inadvertently stumble upon a particular mold which may be processed in a new way and used to fight all manner of illness, which will make any syphilis outbreaks a thing of the past. They write it down, naming it after the frothy look of the blue fungus from which it comes, marispumium, meaning structured like sea foam. With this, the Elysians have discovered penicillin, and, just like with all of their groundbreaking discoveries, they will be sure to keep it close to their chests in future years. There's no need to share this sort of thing with the rest of the world. Not too quickly. Next, let's talk about the great natural wonders of Elysia that we don't have anymore in our own timeline. We know this might seem a bit, touristy, but we assure you that there's a great reason for it. First and foremost, we want to remind literally anyone who cares to listen that the United States of America is built upon a ravaged landscape. We're not talking about the genocides of the indigenous, though that certainly has something to do with exactly why our land is so torn apart in this day and age. Not only was it politically convenient to destroy the land to take the lifestyle of the natives away from them, but more to the point of this particular section of the video, it was domestically expedient to tear down those places to allow better access to the European lifestyle. While it may be something of a misnomer that the American indigenous all lived in perfect harmony with nature like a mid-90s Disney movie, they had integrated their ways of life into the way of the world around them for thousands of years. They understood quite capably how to manage the wilderness in ways that didn't necessarily require its destruction, and in many instances outright relied on great landforms and their preservation to maintain their civilizations. These were societies that were foundationally closer to nature than the highly urbanized European way of life, and the Elysians, growing so sparsely populated over the years, would have to adopt and perfect native knowledge and tradition to make it in the New World over the next century and a half. With that, we want to point to the somewhat recent video on Mini Minuteman's channel covering the Great Raft, an absolutely gigantic wonder of nature that was callously torn apart and burned for the sake of industry and colonialism. Go watch it. Go watch it now! Link in the description, go watch it now! While we could crow on about how it was specifically annihilated in much the same way as the American bison population for the sake of destroying the native way of life, we also want to stress just how incredibly beneficial to the way of industry this project was supposed to be at the time. The Red River would be tamed and managed properly, and people would be able to get their goods faster and more effectively than ever before. But the Elysians have a few reasons why this sort of thing isn't going to happen. First and foremost, they can't do it by 1600. We're certain that the first 20 or 30 years of living around the Great Raft would have inspired many Elysians to just go at it with axes and shovels, since even Elysian fire won't do them much good for the same reasons that they couldn't take out the Shuar during the course of the previous two videos. Simply not enough people, too, and the snag boat won't be invented for quite some time. But at the end of a couple generations, integrating so many native methods into their way of life, they'd probably just learn to live with the Great Raft, and, very quickly thereafter, would add it into their mythology and cultural traditions. As mentioned in the last video, the Elysians grew to love the diverse environments of the New World over the last century and a half. They've grown used to all of the many strange locales present across this landscape that stretch from farthest north to farthest south. And more than that, the natives that once valued these natural wonders now number among them, and deeply influence the way the Elysians look at the world. Because of their feverish recording of all native traditions and practices, it is revealed to the Elysians almost as soon as they arrive that there is a seasonal ebb and flow to the Great Raft itself, times of hunting and foraging, areas of danger, and places of peace and quiet. And they learn, if subtly at first, just how the Great Raft, and wonders like it, affect the environment as a whole. Perhaps, the Empire reasons, this should not be thought of as a great inconvenience to them. The lands around the Great Raft are flourishing ecosystems full of native animals which the Elysians might tame, farm, or hunt. The gentle waxing and waning of regional lakes in the local area allows for highly fertile sections of land to open up for select parts of the year, encouraging seasonal cultivation of important crops that get fertilized, much like on the Nile, by periodic saturation of nutrient-filled waters. To fix the problem of difficult travel through the area, the successors of Rome put together an ingenious operation, the likes of which would make Caesar himself weep with pride. If large boats cannot be maintained through the raft and its subsidies, then pontoon roads would be set up throughout the entirety of the region, able to be quickly removed if things in the raft change, or rebuilt entirely if lost to a flood or crush. Even the heftiest of vehicles can be maintained on this gigantic logjam, which historically could support several horses at a full run. And of course, this is the sort of mindset that the Elysians will take with all of the wonders of nature that they find. Eager to adopt, adapt, and perfect, a holdover from their arrival to the New World as oblivious refugees, the Empire is all too ready to accept the statements of the natives that these great structures are not only part of their way of life, but part of a natural balance that feeds and provides for the people themselves. And once they figure out exactly how this is the case, the smartest and most inventive of Elysians are more than eager to do whatever they can to improve these natural effects. And so, while we've been showing off these entirely modern maps throughout this series, it's also important to remember that the Americas probably look nothing like they do nowadays, or even at the height of our own Industrial Revolution. Free from near extinction of the buffalo, the destruction of the Great Raft, the wholesale annihilation of much of North America's beaver population, and so much more, the landscape has not undergone the drastic changes we saw in our own timeline. Instead, the rivers are curvier, the landscape is greener. 408,000 square miles of forest are not cut down frivolously for a focus on monoculture farming. Lakes are bigger throughout the entirety of the continent. Dozens of animal species have not, and will not, end up going extinct, and society works with the land rather than against it. At least as much as it can. Hetch Hetchy Valley, Guaira Falls, the Great Raft, the Discovery Tree, all these things still stand in the Elysian timeline, and will continue to do so right into the modern day. Not just old and worn-out monuments to nature's glory, but clearly preserved and expanded wonders the likes of which are long gone from our own timeline. On the note of species not being driven to or near to extinction, let's talk about the great animals of Elysia, or rather the greatest animals of Elysia, the ones that really stand at the top as of this video and the time shortly thereafter. Naturally, we've talked about various animals that have been adopted by the Elysians and made into hard-working cogs in the framework of the Elysian economy. But we want to specifically cover just how intensely the Elysians have absolutely lost their minds over the hobby of their forefathers. For the Byzantines would have cheetahs and bears as exotic pets. They found such animals to be pleasant novelties, symbolizing station and social merit. But the Elysians have taken to breeding jaguars and bears as companions and guard stock. They have dedicated huge swaths of land in their sparsely populated empire to the flourishing and study of various different animals, to their taming and training, their breeding, and domestication. Just as they did with the bison, the Elysians' zoomaniacal baby snatching served them well with many other animals. Their incessant recording of things helped them closely monitor and nurture passing generational traits better than any other culture in the world. And their already fascinating supply of animals from both old and new worlds allowed them to make use of pre-existing rules of domestication in the capture and cultivation of previously unknown critters. And there's a lot of options to choose from in the Americas. It has become not only a cultural tradition to keep exotic pets, but a sort of pseudo-manifest destiny to domesticate as many wild animals as possible for the sake of advancing Elysian civilization. And you might be surprised to find out just how fast this process can be carried out. The Russian silver fox was domesticated over the course of less than 50 years using the oldest-fashioned method you can possibly imagine. Simple artificial selection via the bite test. If it bites, it doesn't breed. Back when we were just a little kid, it used to be that most pet reticulated pythons were just unhinged killing machines. It's not if you get bit, it's when you get bit. Most were caught in the wild and smuggled into America by interested private parties. And now, not even half a century later, Most are bred in captivity and never bite. They have all sorts of colors and patterns and different things bred into them, and they get so upset if they accidentally bite you during feeding time that they won't eat for 3 months thereafter. Suffice to say, with a dedicated tradition behind it, the Elysians will begin to enter into a cultural focus we like to call hyper-domestication. Part of being Elysian is to find, study, capture, tame, breed, and domesticate wild animals. And among those animals lie a hallowed club of the greatest in Elysia, those who have picked up the most steam in Elysian society for one reason or another. These beasts come in a variety of categories, and, of course, it is important to remember that they are not solely for these things, but rather these will be the list of best uses for these animals in the public eye. Naturally, also, these are only animals from the Americas. For mounts and animals of burden, we have the obvious bison, moose, and all elk chosen for strength and size, but also the llama, already used as a beast of burden by the Inca, has been specially bred over the last century and a half to be over twice the size it once was. Nimble as any goat or mule, giant Elysian llamas are large and strong enough to carry light riders, and the Elysians use them mostly for scouts in difficult terrain. Fuegian dogs from the bottom of the world have been incorporated into the average family household alongside the capybara and coyotes, while various breeds of wolf have been readily incorporated into already present dog populations throughout the empire. Weird hybrid experiments between wolves, conventional dogs, and coyotes have been carried out throughout the last half-century, especially to make new breeds of dogs that bear surprisingly little resemblance to the old world dogs that the Eastern Romans brought with them. Sharp as tacks and exhibiting a surprising cunning unlike any of their progenitors, the people have started experimenting with the breeding of higher intelligence into these canis Elysiae. While this experiment is very rudimentary right now, mostly consisting of breeding together Elysian hybrid hounds that understand the most tricks and have the widest diversity of duties, the future will bring this hobby into a very powerful direction that we'll start talking about in later videos when it starts to mean more. The raccoon has also wormed its way into the hearts of nearly every Elysian throughout the entirety of the Americas. Just as personable as the hybrid Elysian hound with their little hands and masks, and far more intelligent by leaps and bounds, all species of raccoon are captured, tamed, trained, and domesticated by eager breeders trying to produce a new companion for the common man. Fairly comprehensive experiments have also resulted in a sort of pan-procyon raccoon whose genetics amount to a horrific amalgam of every raccoon species that could produce fertile offspring together. This Roman raccoon is also a monster, benefiting extensively from classic hybrid gigantism and hybrid vigor just as the Elysian hounds do. Averaging around 60 pounds, these intelligent beasts are often found living up to 30 years in the comfort of Elysian homes, tussling with dogs and snoozing next to lazy capybaras. But the Elysians don't only have four-legged companions. Romans always had a fascination with corvids, and here in the Americas, they found that the natives had an even greater obsession with the feathered friends around them. Parrots as well, a highly prized animal by the natives of the New World, have found themselves at the center of Elysian attention. Both of these groups of animals, extremely smart and exceedingly sociable, have the capacity to speak the human language, and, much like with the Elysian hybrid hounds, the Empire as a whole is focused on how they can expand and enhance this intelligence through artificial selection. The smartest and most talkative birds who can carry on the most intelligible conversations are more often bred than not, and people specifically buy and breed corvids and parrots for the purpose of trying to breed the most talkative and intelligent bird to date. So powerful is this trend that, by the year 1600, hyper-domestication has taken the common raven from a maximum average vocabulary of around 100 words to around 1,000. While this might not seem like the largest jump in social capacity, it is important to remember that it covers about the same speech gap as a 20-month-old to a 3-year-old. The parents out there will know just how much progress that can really be, and they managed to carry out this progress in just over 100 years. With the average talking parrot mastering an average of around 60 words throughout their own lives, and those lives being considerably longer, the Elysians have made less progress, but by the year 1600, they still managed to hatch out parrots that regularly master up to 500 words, about the social capacity of a 2.5-year-old human. Year by year, decade by decade, the companion experiments, as we'll call them for this scenario, will continue to work their way into the very foundations of what it means to be Elysian. While other nations around the world are working on animals that please them with meaningless cosmetic traits through detrimental popular trends, the Empire will instead focus on making their companions smarter and more receptive to command. After all, Elysia is a giant nation of wide open spaces and fairly low population density. Even if we say that just over half of the land in the Americas is just uninhabitable at this point in history, hardly a given, that still means that the entirety of the New World only has an overall population density of around 14 people per square mile, meaning that the average Elysian has around, bare minimum, roughly 45 acres of land to mess around with. And obviously, there are some cities and large communities within the Empire, meaning that the overall population density nationwide is even less than that. They've already started their own industrial revolution just to save effort and make up for lack of extra hands. If they can make smarter companion animals that can better accept commands and maintain a higher level of diligence and independence without human input, well then, all of that will take even more weight off of the Empire that's been stretched so thin for the last century and a half that they are barely keeping a consistent national identity. But not all are delightful pets seeking the fast track to pseudo-sapience. The Elysians have not shunned the art of breeding war animals. Cheetahs and bears were the pets of the aristocracy in the olden days, but now domesticated cougars and jaguars are starting to make an appearance as infiltration beasts against Incan border forts, able to be instructed to climb into secure locations and cause all sorts of chaos from the inside as human soldiers batter down the doors and gain entry while the defenders are distracted. Wolverines, in stark contrast, have become a rather standard guard animal for military strongholds, trusting only to those soldiers who raise them, kept fat and happy as loyal armory and inventory wardens. Bears, both grizzly and black, take up positions in many military units as haulers and breakers, learning as cubs how to carry heavy things around in a manner not dissimilar from Wojtek in our own timeline, or sent ahead to slam down lesser barricades and reinforce doors hiding canny defenders. Smart as they are, bears are slowly working their way into higher recognition in Elysian society as well, earning all manner of affection from the common folk for their propensity to do tricks and follow basic commands like dogs. Privately, slowly, some bear breeders from the Northern Territories are considering attempting some of the same intelligence selection experiment with bears that have borne so much fruit with dogs, birds, and raccoons. And of course, the outlier is the mighty Fighting Rhea. While remarkably stupid, the Greater Rhea served as a perfect testbed for a cultural experiment that went hideously right. Having read of the Old World's ostrich, the Elysians decided the Rhea could hypothetically become an appropriate replacement. An already fairly aggressive animal when they want to be, it was only a matter of selective breeding to hone that natural surliness to a keen edge that could be directed against their enemies. Able to punch out up to 60 very large eggs a year, the Greater Rhea easily made more of itself for experimentation. Perhaps best of all, such a bird can reach nearly 6 feet tall, meaning the lofty 9-foot ostrich goal only requires a 50 to 60% increase in height through breeding. Entirely achievable goals in a fairly short amount of time for an animal that hypothetically reaches sexual maturity in just over a year and lays dozens of eggs every year after. Now, 100 years after the goal was set, the Fighting Rhea is an 8-foot-tall, 250-pound monstrosity with an unusually sharp sense of smell and an aggressive attitude. Bred and trained to become viciously driven at certain smells, this breed of Rhea is smashed into big crates and released onto the battlefield after an artillerist fires off a loaded mortar shell full of their favorite food and aggressor scents into the opposing forces. Once those shells splatter against the enemy lines and shower them with foul stench, the fighting Rheas rush out of their boxes to feast on their foes. Not exactly humane, but it tends to get results, and it's remarkably easy on manpower. The particular slurry that causes such a frenzied assault in this breed of bird is known only to select military breeders, and while American ratites do their part in other portions of the economy, from feather to leather, egg to meat, the fighting Rhea is an all-too-common staple in Elysian tactics for breaking up tightly massed groups of enemy soldiers that simply can't be bombarded out of existence with fire and bullet. Not all of the greatest animals of Elysia are companions, warriors, mounts, or beasts of burden, however. The largely herbivorous iguana has become a staple in the Elysian diet, being placid and able to subsist off of grass and leaves, while eventually growing to over 6.5 feet long. They barely even need to be domesticated with how amicable they are as lizards go, but the Elysians have taken them over the last 100 years and bred an iguana that averages about 40 pounds when good and healthy. In some sections of the Empire, people still hunt wild iguanas, but with the advent of paddle steamers that can traverse the Empire in fairly short order, it's become fashionable to import entire ships of farmed iguanas live to various locations of the Empire while keeping them in gently heated cargo holds. In the more northern territories, marmot is on the menu. While muskrat is common and nutria have become a farmed favorite throughout the Americas, the yellow-bellied and hoary marmots have been hybridized into the real star of the show, the domestic merchant marmot. Growing up to 23 pounds on average and bulking out to twice that weight in autumn for hibernation, these chubby, jovial-looking rodents are deliciously fat additions to every holiday meal at the end of the fall harvest. In recent years, their adorably pudgy faces and round bodies have gained them quite a bit of attention in the aristocracy, despite their vacuous stupidity and general laziness. Naturally, the turkey stands as one of every Elysian's favorite birds to eat. In much the same way as we have now, it didn't take long to invent many breeds of turkey, including ones that look remarkably like some of the jolly gobblers we think of today. Just as in our own timeline, there is a score of holidays dedicated to stuffing turkeys and eating until your stomach is literally about to rupture, but the contents of it all probably look nothing like what you're thinking. But a standout sits at the fore as a truly utilitarian animal that the Elysians have embraced wholeheartedly. The tapir. Well-mannered, possessing of a thick back hide and a rotund appearance, tapirs are reportedly quite delicious, and their hides useful. Subsisting off a diet of fruits, berries, leaves, and water plants, there are all too many opportunities to farm them in the expanded bayous and lakelands of Louisiana around the Great Raft, and other such places where the rivers spill out into the surrounding landscape. Finally, a few select groups of animals have made themselves the best fur and hide animals from Elysia, barring the sidelong choices. First and foremost, the alligator quickly found its way into the Elysian arsenal of leather-bearing animals to be farmed and exploited. A very efficient society, little in Elysia goes to waste. Even the nastiest guts and worst cuts go somewhere, and, often enough, whatever is so bad that it can't be fed to the dogs goes to the gator farms. Naturally waterproof and tough, gator leather makes amazing boots for muddy areas and resists the stinging and biting of insects like no other. Various hares throughout the entirety of the American continent have also been taken in by the Elysians and bred with wild abandon. Hare fur is an excellent insulator, while also being breathable and comfortable against the skin if kept clean and well-maintained. While they also brought their own rabbits from the Old World, the Elysians have long since fallen in love with all of the amazing lagomorphs the New World has to offer, and it has been well over 100 years since they started collecting every long-eared bouncer they can get their hands on. At 3 feet long, the sea mink was the largest of all minks before the late 1800s, and the American mink is suspected to have been able to hybridize with them. When the Elysians arrived, their number would have been unrestrained, and sea mink would have been all over the shores all the way down to Connecticut, where the Eastern Romans made their first capital site of Nea Roma. Now, 150 years later, they've domesticated both the sea mink and the American mink, hybridizing the two into the Olympian mink, a 4-foot-long water weasel that acts as both a fishing companion and a good source of beautiful high-quality fur. And finally, you knew this was coming, the beaver! Pulling triple duty as a fur factory, a yummy living fat storage in the winter, and a literal environmental engineer, the beaver has gained near universal reverence by the Elysian people, who have long since recognized the importance of this humble but mighty animal. Many different indigenous cultures of the New World recognize the beaver as a symbol of creativity, hard work, cooperation, diligence, and wisdom. In a few select Native American tales, beavers even had a part in the creation of the very Earth itself. While Elysian mythology does not revere the beaver quite so much as this, the Empire has long since grasped the potential utility of the animal in watching how it can completely overturn ecosystems and shape the very land itself in but a few short years. Where long, straight rivers flow through arid regions with accompanying companion forests following along, beavers may be deployed by Elysian castor farmers to go about damming up the fast-moving waters and cultivating fertile oxbows while enriching the land around them. To say nothing of their vanilla-tasting, raspberry-smelling anal glands produced by modern cultures to this very day to be used in perfumes and high-class treats. Just remember, next time you get a hilariously expensive designer brand vanilla ice cream with natural flavors on the ingredients list, there is a non-zero chance that it has been at least partially flavored with beaver ass. Just look up Castoreum. With a capable beaver farming industry and a lack of trapping industry to fuel the fashions of the old world, the glorious North American population of up to 400 million beavers before the colonization has stayed fairly stable over the last century and a half, and become a symbol of Elysian engineering and ingenuity through the use of animal solutions. The Elysians have learned the hard way that they lack the technology and skill to shape the land by themselves, as realized in their futile attempts to destroy the Great Raft during the first few generations after discovering it. All the same, the gods have provided the beaver with all the tools to undo what progress they can make anyway. Clearly made to humble humanity, beavers have shown the Empire that humans are not the only animals to build houses, form communities, and deeply affect the environment around them. And their particular skill set was given to them by the divine to show humanity that even Rome's mighty progress can be undone if nature so desires it. Just as with the great wonders of nature that Elysia could not destroy, the Empire comes to the inevitable conclusion that not only will beavers have to be something they learn to live alongside, but even embrace as another tool in their arsenal to shape the world around them. And now that we've wasted 6 pages of your life talking about weird domestication experiments that we wish we could do ourselves, but the Romans would do much better if given the opportunity, we can get to the real story. Naturally, there are dozens, perhaps even hundreds more animals from the New World that the Elysians have taken to breeding and domesticating, not only for their utility but for their own pleasures. But if people really want to take a deep dive into the hyper-domestication focus of the Elysian culture, they can tell us in the comments. If we get, we'll say 250 likes on this video, we'll consider making a supplementary episode on the deeper workings of daily life in Elysia around the early post-Mustafan War period, or 1600 to 1620. In the meantime, let's get to the real name of the video. Let's get to Elysia's Pacific colonization, because that is going to get to the real meat and potatoes of this episode. As mentioned in Ottoman Boogaloo, the Elysians originally started colonizing the Pacific Ocean for the sake of keeping the Portuguese and Spanish from sailing around Cape Horn and finding a way to access Asia through their waters. The Portuguese and Spanish circumnavigation of the globe, therefore, never happened. Those explorers that did skip across their coastlines were hunted down before they ever passed the Horn, while the biggest European powers of our own timeline quickly lost their foreign holdings to war and their domestic holdings to the Ottoman advance. So the Elysians, even up to the Mustafan War, were plying the waves of the Pacific, stringing along the Aleutian Islands, and hopping about southern Polynesia with wild abandon, all the while making friends and taking notes on literally every rock they found jutting out of the water, and sticking a hut and garden on it if there was enough room even for that. As discussed in the first video of this series, Elysians are, in the deepest cockles of their hearts, maybe even the subcockle area, Greeks! And Greeks have been sticking tiny single-person dwellings on rocks jutting out of the sea for thousands of years and just haven't ever stopped. It's in their blood. So the Polynesian islands and atolls are not some sort of difficult place for them to manage. Quite the opposite. They are warm, delightful utopias for aspiring Elysian settlers looking to have hilariously large families while surrounded by nothing but the sun and the surf for as far as the eye can see. And this spurs on yet more exploration, yet more colonization. Natives who are met, just as with the natives of the New World, are embraced and studied as deeply as possible so that their traditions and cultural methods may also be adopted and perfected by the Elysian cause. New crops like giant taro and candlenut, breadfruit and jackfruit, mastwood and bamboo are all returned to America to be incorporated into whatever systems they can be. Even just their first voyages into the deeper ranges of Polynesia bring back so much progress that the Elysians decide, as a people, that they're simply not leaving. The Pacific gives the Elysian Empire untold opportunities to practice their newly budding modern naval traditions, huge benefits from the bounty of the sea, and over 10,000 miles of functional buffer zone throughout which Elysian ships may patrol and destroy anything that displeases them. Meanwhile, by 1600, even during the height of the Mustafan War, Elysians have already made small settlements on continental Asia and started dealing with the natives, with extremely selective trade being done with the rare Ainu from the south to maintain good relations. Fascinated by this new land, it is not a mystery to the Empire that they must have colonized Asia, and just to the south, they must eventually meet the people of Serica. And so, a prepared diplomatic fleet sails into Ainu lands, taking the opportunity to show off their technology and skill to the Ainu people, and extend hands of cooperation and friendship to the people of Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the Kurils. These are a hardy but friendly people who have a very different lifestyle, finely tailored to nature in this part of the world. They love to leave their own borders and seek trade with others, and they have a similar fascination with bears as the Elysians do. Yes, good friends can be made in the Ainu, even if they are quite barbaric by the standards of the Elysians. In time, perhaps, they can be civilized and integrated into the Elysian way of things. In the meantime, it is good to know that the Elysian ships will be welcome in their ports. Journeying south, they find none other than Japan. And Japan is currently in a sorry state. Having lost the Injun War just 2 years ago, the country is in a state of regency. If you've seen the 2004 show Shogun on Hulu, same shit. Like, literally, exactly the same shit. Tokugawa Ieyasu was coming into supremacy, he had the Battle of Sekigahara to go through just later that year, and in this timeline, it's the Ottomans that brought guns to Japan, however fleetingly, so the big guy's probably not interested in the current enemy of their once greatest trading partners to the west. Not knowing this, however, the Elysian trade fleet arrives and is redirected to Edo, where it is promptly held captive by Tokugawa Ieyasu and put under trial. A few Elysians die, merely as an example to instill loyalty, but, without too much argument, the Elysians are able to convince the Japanese that they are, in fact, traitors and not pirates. Their holds are full of Elysian goods, just looking to be sold. Fine, high-quality goods. And the paranoid daimyo need only peruse their holds and deal with them. Begrudgingly, Tokugawa comes to the conclusion that the Elysians are far too organized and have acquitted themselves far too well under pressure to be pirates, too uniform and obvious. But he cannot bother with traders from the distant east at this point. It irritates the man even more that the Elysian Empire didn't even know of this domain, that they were seeking instead to trade with China, with the enemy that Japan so recently lost to, with the force that had torn his nation into pieces and left him in the conflict he was in now. No. He has a war he must fight, and the Elysians, enemies of the Muslim traders that have made such good friends with the country in recent years, are not welcome in Japan. Though Tokugawa is not willing to go so far as to interfere directly with their mission. Simply put, he tells the Elysian fleet to be on their way and not come back. And no, they are not to be given directions to China. They are not to be given directions to the enemy. So, instead, the fleet travels south and finds its way to the kingdom of Ryukyu. Just a few decades ago, it had been the Ryukyuan golden age of maritime trade, but now, due to Japanese pirates from the north, fading preferential treatment from China, and a lack of capacity to launch their own trade fleets to the south quite so frequently, the Ryukyu kingdom is slowly falling into decline. So you can imagine the Elysian trade fleet is eagerly and excitedly welcomed into the ports of Shuri, where the Elysian delegation is finally treated with some proper respect for once. They're given a direct audience with King Shonei, who finds the Elysians fascinating and welcomes them happily directly into his own personal court. There he tells them of the troubles with Japan to the north, and how they have numerous times been told to bend the knee to the Empire's ambitions, though Shonei has chosen to simply ignore most of the imperial requests, like the certified Chad that he is. The Elysians agree that this simply cannot stand, and vow to deliver the news of Ryukyu's civility to the Empire, that they might be assisted in the protection of their own islands. Here, at the far end of the Pacific, and so close to Serica, they are eager to incorporate a friend and ally into their plans for future trade into Asia. And the king of the Ryukyu kingdom is so civilized and cosmopolitan that it is difficult for the Elysians to keep from liking him. Naturally, after a few months of leisurely relaxation and restock in the Ryukyu kingdom, the trade fleets set sail directly west to the lands of China, given appropriate directions by Shonei's navigators. With a summary purchase of a small island on the fringes of the kingdom, the Elysians have secured themselves an outpost to help trade and military protection spread across Ryukyu. Knowing that new fleets will be safe upon their return, they are sure they will be well received in Beijing. But of course, they are not well received in Beijing. Instead, they are rejected outright. Trade is not allowed in the port of Beijing, and what foreign trade is allowed in China must be done hundreds of miles to the south at approved ports. The Elysians make pleas that they've come over 10,000 miles to do business with the Chinese emperor directly, but they are told that if their gifts of tribute are quite so important as to gain the attention of the Emperor of China himself, then they will be more than happy to wait at the approved locations. The Elysians tell the people at the port of Beijing that surely there must be some sort of mistake. They are the successors to Rome, the civilization of the West opposite China, who have come so far that they now reach their equivalent from the East. They have come all this way to trade with the Rome of the East. Is the system not flexible enough to allow for such a momentous occasion as this? But, of course, the people that meet them wave their hands dismissively and tell them that Rome was the China of the West, and is long since gone. Its true successor is the Ottoman Caliphate. They have heard of the pretender state who calls itself the daughter of Rome, and they have no reason to treat the Elysians any differently than anyone else. Even the Ottoman Caliph, if he came to China personally, would be made to wait at the approved ports. Begrudgingly, the Elysians sail hundreds of miles south to said ports, but there they are turned down again. They have brought no gifts for the emperor, so they insist, but are rather here to do trade with the emperor personally and present him with the great advancements of the Elysian Empire, as though he were some kind of equal to the Elysian Empire. They are not here to bend the knee and kiss the ground at his feet. And of course, that isn't really allowed in China. But what's worse, they have no credentials to show, no proof that they are who they say they are. Simply put, they are not even allowed to show what they have to offer before they are turned down and told to go back home. Besides, The Wanli Emperor is currently seeking a policy of extreme isolationism for all of China, and that trend would continue into the Qing dynasty, so there's no reason to believe they would trade with the Elysians anyway. And with that, we gotta pay some bills, so we're gonna take a break here and ask you to please watch this silly advertisement for a bunny farm. Or don't, if you're against someone trying to make a living the old-fashioned way, we guess. Hey everyone. Times are tough these days. Money's tight, some people are losing their livelihoods, families are split up, and loneliness is at an all-time high. People all too commonly judge each other for trivial things, and some days it just seems like the world is a dark place. But worry not. There is light in this dark world. There is something to live for, something that can bring you happiness when nothing else can. Something that will be there for you even when nobody else is. Bunnies. They don't judge you, they don't ask troublesome questions, they don't have inflammatory political positions, and they don't hold things against you. All they care about is food, water, relaxation, and affection. They love to bounce, and run, and snuggle, and chill. The bare necessities of life. Beauty in simplicity, and full of nothing but love for those who take care of them. And there are no better bouncing baby bunnies than over at West Coast Warrens. There they have all manner of different rabbits available, from chubbly fuzz bunnies to sleek and curious crack rabbits, itty-bitty dwarfs to salt and pepper silver foxes, and all at affordable, dare we say it, competitive prices. All of their rabbits are also raised among cats and dogs, and so can be trusted to coexist with all of your other lovely members of your four-legged family. Pumped out by a veritable platoon of supermoms, the farm always has something in stock for any eager and excited would-be owners, and every dollar you spend on their farm goes right back into the system to ensure the expansion and update of even and better environments for their throng of fuzz cadets. If there's a rabbit out there for you, you'll find it at West Coast Warrens. Wait, you say you don't want a rabbit? You aren't looking for a pet? Well, that's just fine, because West Coast Warrens also produces delicious farm-fresh eggs in multiple colors, batched up for your eating pleasure at extremely competitive prices in this economy. If you call ahead, they can even set up the incubator and have baby birds available for you in less than a month. They're getting the gardens going for fresh produce, have been known to sell rabbit manure, the best there is, and even have some rabbit meat available if you're interested in trying new things. The lovely matron of the farm, Elaine Long, has been planning on starting up her canning kitchen for all manner of artisan goods, and it's only a matter of time until the blackberries start overrunning the property once again, bringing with them the glorious bounty of the late summertime harvest. If you're in the Hebo, Oregon area, you should stop on by. You'll find them at 36490 Highway 22 out in lovely coastal Oregon, just outside of Hebo. Contact Elaine for more information at 503-544-1770 or at elainec32@gmail.com. No matter what you're looking for from the farm, you're certain to find it at West Coast Warrens. After a bit of a scene, and some serious diplomatic shenaniganery that barely avoids the death of many Elysian envoys, the trade fleet leaves, holds still mostly full, back toward the north. Eventually, their sailing along the Chinese coastline leads them to the shores of a new kingdom, however. A kingdom just 2 years off winning their own greatest battle against the Japanese, and full of all sorts of contempt and irritation at their overlords. The Elysians find themselves landing in Joseon, Korea. Go check out Morikoa. Oh my god, seriously, go check out Morikoa. Holy shit, they're all fucking amazing artists. Oh my god, go check them out right now. Now, we really need to stress something here. The Eastern Romans had information on Korea. They had heard about the people of Goguryeo, the predecessors to Joseon, and they liked what they heard. For they'd gathered that, quote, the people of Goguryeo are said to possess a strong spirit to overcome crises, coupled with their relentless determination honed through rigorous military training that is part of their daily lives. Unquote. If the Elysians had arrived even a few decades ago, this may well have not been the case, But the Joseon have just come off the Imjin War, and their military ingenuity, readiness, and martial culture have been stoked back into a raging bonfire of national determination by the late Admiral Yi Sun-sin. While many of their weapons seemed rudimentary compared to Elysian stock, the trade fleet captain realized all too quickly that these people were actually quite innovative, inventive, and inclined to use what they had. It is not long until they hear about the failings of King Seonjo during the Imjin War, of his abandonment of his people, and his continued demonization and slander of the admiral who consistently drove back the Japanese and invented entirely new weapons of war to save the peninsula. And ho, what weapons they are! The Joseon, being creative and inventive, had not even adopted widespread metal currency, but had invented timed explosive mortar shells, multiple rocket launcher systems, timed depth charges, gun cranes, poison gas grenades, 3-person portable cannon teams, shotguns, automatic crossbows, landmines, swivel cannons with repeatable loaders, armored anti-boarding ships with dragon heads that breathe fire all over the enemy vessels, watches that shoot at enemies far away and then breathe fire on them when they get too close, giant fucking arrows the size of support beams that they shoot out of cannons into enemy ships, modular barrel pistols, gun tridents, pistol flails, war wagons, flexible bulletproof armor, tanks! Oh boy, they got tanks! The list just goes on and on and on. It's love at first sight. How, the Elysians end up asking, have the Joseon not taken up the position as dominant power in the region? Well, it's the Ming. The Ming are the reason that the Joseon have been held back for centuries. Even today, Ming envoys regularly ridicule the Joseon for being the successors to Goguryeo, a strong martial power that now spends most of their resources focusing on agriculture and scholarship. This, despite the fact that the Middle Kingdom is the one that has dealt out harsh reprisals to any major Joseon military buildup for as long as anyone can remember. The soldiers grow their own crops and sell them at market because they are so poor. The most a nation can raid Joseon for is their books, which are present even in the poorest of households, where food is scarce. And yet, only at the stoking of the Imjin War did their military spirit truly return to them, only now to be stamped out once again by King Seonjo and visiting Ming's agents. This, the Elysians assert, cannot stand. Clearly, the Romans of old were mistaken to assert that China was the Rome of the East. Or, perhaps, like so many nations, they were the Rome of the East, but the mandate for that title had fallen from them when they became inflexible and decadent, falling to Goguryeo, and now the Joseon, who themselves are constantly being held down by the envy and tyranny of the Chinese. The Chinese are inflexible, unadaptive, decadent, self-important, and isolationist. They are everything the Elysians are not. The Joseon, in stark contrast, are everything the Elysians stain their bedding over whenever they have idle dreams at night about how Asia must be. No. This will never do. A sleeping dragon as inventive and dedicated as the Joseon cannot be held down by the might of kings. Since they are no friends to the Ming, King Seonjo views the Elysians with distance and paranoia, so they find their way to the son of the late Admiral Yi, who himself is a strong man who would go on to have a long and prosperous military career in our own timeline. His father had escaped execution at the hands of the king twice, and at his funeral, the king himself had shown no remorse or sadness, no shock or grief. All of the great military awards due to him were denied. And now, Seonjo sought to besmirch the name of the man who saved the kingdom, Yi Ho's own father, the man who had never lost a single naval engagement. He who had failed the Joseon people at every turn was trying now to destroy the honor and legacy of the man who had personally saved his life. The people supported Yiho, and they understood how the king had failed them. Perhaps it was time, like the Roman kings of old, that the Joseon kings be cast away, and the Joseon government be reformed into a vast and prosperous imperial republic. Perhaps Joseon can still be the Rome of the East, if only to be encouraged by a power that understood their plight. And the more they looked into the Joseon culture, the more they see the parallels. The Joseon are not merely a military power, but, as already mentioned, an academic one. Scholarship is one of the highest pursuits in their culture, and even the poorest can afford to read books of poetry and philosophy. Early forensics has been practiced for quite some time in Joseon, and they are currently in the process of compiling a comprehensive medical encyclopedia for the entirety of the nation to learn from and appreciate. They have hippocausts, just like the Romans, and a comprehensive guild system. A stringent legal code covers the whole of society, such that their folklore includes fantastic stories like spirits of the dead haunting government buildings for the sake of filing legal claims. And much like the Elysians themselves, they are very quick to adopt any new technologies they find useful, despite being a fairly conservative culture in the most general sense. And they're chronicling. They're chronicling. The Elysians, perhaps, may have thought the Joseon is a bit quaint on arrival, but after investigating how they record, it is clear the Elysians still have some things to learn from the rest of the world. For you see, the Joseon were so feverish in their chronicling of events that even matters ordered to be struck from the record were preserved, and the orders of their removal preserved along with them. A king couldn't even go out into the country to see his mistress without half a score of scribes stalking him into the woods to record his royal privilege in intimate detail. Due to their former lack of military might, the best way they'd found to answer to the Jurchen tribes to the north was to maintain such an adequate spy network that the names and hobbies of nearly every foreigner across the border for nearly 100 miles was known and recorded. This stood above even the incredible century and a half of constant chronicling by the Elysians by leaps and bounds. Once again, it was true love at first sight. And so the decision was made, knowing that the Emperor of Elysia would find this venture quite worthwhile, to affect politics in Joseon, Korea, and back the claim of Yiho to overtake the aristocracy and instate an imperial republic a la the Romans of old. There was only one problem standing in their way. To the north lie the Jurchen tribes, and actively unifying them was the great warlord Nurhaci, who himself was quite the scholar, and had all too many legitimate reasons to hate the Ming and their actions against him and his. This man, though he did not know it at the time, would be the one to end the Ming dynasty, and establish the Qing thereafter. And if the Elysians were to help the Joseon overthrow the Chinese, becoming the Rome of the East, that would not be allowed. Nurhaci's ambitions would need to be deflected elsewhere so that the Joseon could rise to their true potential and overthrow the Ming themselves. Even if this great Khan was a profound leader, a consummate scholar, and a legitimately good man that the Elysians wanted no conflict with, he would have to be convinced to let the Empire across the waves have their way. And so, from Joseon, the Elysians mounted an expedition into the steppe to meet this man and convince him that there were other options. The journey was difficult, but by early 1601, an audience was gained with the Khan, and the diplomats of the trade fleet got to know him. He was a great leader, a man who had commissioned the invention of his language's own script, and his ambitions amazed his guests. At first, they had a hard time admitting, even to themselves, that they should continue their mission, as his very birthplace was just beyond Joseon borders, and it seemed so wrong to ask him to abandon not only his mission against the Ming, but his homeland altogether. However, they knew their duty, and the Elysians had long since found chemical ways of convincing people to change their minds. Having long ago integrated medical practices involving the healing and manipulation of the mind and soul into their pharmacopoeia, an Elysian matriarch sent on the voyage to represent the ultimate spiritual authority of their pantheon to foreigners invites Nurhaci to spend a few days with her on a guided meditative journey, a vision quest. This, she tells him, will help bring clarity to his mission and provide him with divine insights that he couldn't otherwise achieve with Asian ways. Hesitantly, the Khan agrees to this brief spiritual journey with the matriarch. But those few days become weeks, and those weeks stretch out into over a month. Throughout many days and nights of strange concoctions, purgative episodes, trance states, guided meditation, feverish dancing, and incoherent chanting in the privacy of her own personal lodge, Nurhaci emerges from his trip with the matriarch a changed man. A new man. His ambitions for conquest have not subsided. Quite the opposite. They've only expanded. But it is to the west that they've expanded, not the south. So many steppe tribes and petty kingdoms litter the lands to the west, who might still be unified under what he will call the Eight Banners Empire. Once upon a time, the Mongols themselves threatened to overtake Europe, and even the mighty Romans trembled in fear at the approach of their tyranny. Now the descendants of the Romans and the descendants of the steppe might work together to make that ancient possibility a reality. The Ottomans had just been struck a mighty blow, and the Muslim powers were starting to weaken just as Nurhaci was starting to rise. It was not time to focus on grievances of his own life, but to focus on the unfulfilled dreams of lives past. Now Nurhaci would spread across the steppe, just as others had before him, and seize Persia and Anatolia. He would wash his feet in the Mediterranean and write his name across the frigid lands of Russia. And there he could gather untold wealth, spread countless new peoples across his growing empire, and seize the valuable Silk Road of Genghis Khan for untold profit and glory the world over. The largest contiguous empire that Eurasia had ever seen could belong to the steppe once again. And if only he would stand aside and let the Joseon achieve their destiny, the Elysians would step up and give Nurhaci what he really wanted. The Wanli Emperor who Nurhaci so hated. His grievances would be addressed by the Elysians, and the Ming Emperor and all of his family would be passed off to the Eight Banners Empire for Nurhaci to do with as he pleased. Eventually, so these forward-thinking traders had decided, the Khan would strike at Europe. The Ainu and Ryukyu could help overtake Japan, and the Joseon Koreans would overthrow the Ming and take up their rightful place as the true Rome of the East, ally and client in Asia to the Elysian Empire. Fascinated by this proposal and entranced by the many variables of Asian politics and the state of things across the waves, the emperor, now fresh off the Mustafan War, spares no expense to take the Ogasawara Islands, whatever islands he can buy or colonize, really, and sets out to maintain these new attachments to the various powers of Asia. The Ryukyu must be protected, the Ainu enriched, Nurhaci pacified with select goods from the New World, and the Joseon. Oh, the Joseon! There's so much to be done with the Joseon. Fresh off his failed war in Europe, the aging Elysian emperor takes a trip across the Pacific to meet with Yiho and personally back his claims to overthrow King Seonjo and bring Korea into the upfront and forefront of Asian politics. Strong, charismatic, accomplished, and intelligent, Yiho is able to overthrow the weak and aging Seonjo and promptly goes about working with the Elysians to construct an imperial republic that would have made his father proud. All the while, the son of the Elysian Emperor, not yet taking the mantle for himself, goes to Korea and oversees their operations. Joseon inventions must be brought to Elysia, whereas Elysian crops and updated blueprints for military and domestic technologies must return to Korea and help update their society. Military bases and Elysian embassies must be constructed for the development of good relations and the protection of Joseon borders. Comprehensive guarantees to independence are declared, while new adaptations of Joseon technologies must be talked out and then field tested on the Asian theater against the Ming and Japanese. Even the very systems under which the Joseon live must be adapted to the Elysian way of life and perfected. After all, certain factors of their culture outright exceed the Elysian way of things. There's so much to do, and it's so consequential that doing all of this will work its way into the very foundations of Elysian identity within just a couple short generations. A vast interchange is about to begin that will change both the new and old worlds forever, and will finally take this timeline from the realm of just unrealistic to outright historical fanfiction. The butterflies by this point have ultimately made the scenario of the Third Odyssey much less of a serious question and much more of a real-deal Europa Universalis wet dream. Even so, the fans want it, so we're going to start heading into the end of this episode with a comprehensive update of things as they stand by about 1605, maybe as far as 1610, with the cultural effects of exploring Asia starting to work their way into the comprehensive reform the Emperor has enacted at the end of his life. First and foremost, the addition of contact with Asia has brought forth all of the glories of Eastern medicine, Ayurveda, early forensics by way of the Joseon, and a surprising amount of interesting and potentially useful medicines that were not available in Europe and the New World. The might of Elysian healthcare, a system now going full public by way of the Emperor's reforms, is growing grander and more prosperous than ever before. And the crowning achievement of this system, just introduced from Korea, is variolation and inoculation. Smallpox, the killer of dynasties, still plagued the Elysians just as it plagued everywhere else. But the Chinese had long since discovered that inert scabs, dried and crushed into a powder, could be given to a patient to prefer immunity in roughly 30% of the cases. Though roughly 1 to 2% of such patients would inevitably contract real-deal smallpox, many ways by both Chinese and Joseon philosophers had been invented to reduce this number, with some known doctors having records of never having made a patient properly sick in their entire careers. This is a game changer. Though it is obviously imperfect, the Empire immediately latches onto this new technology and investigates how it might be perfected. Little do they know that the secrets of this technique will be opened to them over the course of mere decades, by which point they will be ready to advance that field of medical science to its obvious conclusion. It's only a matter of a generation or two before the Elysians invent the first vaccines. And then the horror that struck rich and poor alike, killed the Greek and Aztec, Egyptian and Russian all together, would be a thing of the past. Never something to worry about, ever again. But the Mustafan War also brought its own progress. Though technically a loss, the Emperor returned with countless new developments that Elysia had missed out on by escaping to the New World. Microscopes and telescopes, printing presses and clockwork, navigational technology, and the newest updates in material sciences and naval architecture all came back with him, all to be copied, translated, copied again, studied, reverse engineered, reproduced, and perfected back at the shipyards of Nea Roma and the mouth of the Yggdrasil. That dude who made the first steam engines, bro's absolutely rich. Completely fucking loaded. Like, we wish we could be even half as fucking rich as that guy. And the Emperor still pays out of his own pockets to embrace every new invention that he finds might be useful to the Elysian people. His people deserve only the very best, after all, and this will ultimately break the Elysian economy right before the end of his life in just under a decade, slowing the more social and legal reforms of the Empire, even as the technological and trade reforms race forward. and unfortunately causing no shortage of internal strife throughout the course of his own son's rule. Even so, the Elysian Industrial Revolution has officially begun, at least on paper. Steam power is becoming cheaper and more popular, the old oil seeps have begun being harvested for alternative fuel sources so that the natural wonders of the New World might be preserved, experimental steamships are beginning their first adventures into the Pacific, and new allies out near new colonies are beginning to advance the Elysian agenda as far as central Russia and the Middle East. Asian holdings are bringing in countless new commodities that Elysians have never before imagined, and talks of buying the rest of Greenland from the Scandinavian League are in the works. Though there might be problems on the horizon, for the time being the Elysian Empire is at its most stable and prosperous. Never before have things been so well for so many people, even despite the recent white peace with Europe. The Emperor is now reforming the very Elysian way of life, and all of these variables have solidified into a proper cultural identity that will be enforced among the common folk from down at Cape Horn to all the way out in Kamchatka. And what exactly is it that makes Elysian culture, you ask? Obviously, there could be a lot to explain, but we'll end the video on what we like to call the 6 great cultural focuses of Elysia. We've already sort of teased at them before, but it's just after 1600, with the introduction of Joseon recording standards, the adoption of certain Asian technologies, and the vested interest in West Pacific commerce, that these focuses become hard-set traditions that cannot be separated from what it means to be Elysian. Everywhere they go, these 6 cultural focuses apply. Everyone they meet will see these things to be what identifies them and sets them apart from all others. Every colony they set up will revolve around these 6 ideals. And at the top of the list, their most ancestral of cultural focuses, is the legacy of Rome. All of the great things we think of when we think of Romans at their best, that is what this people holds dear. While their true understanding of this time is lost, the tropes and stereotypes remain, and it is those that the Elysians seek to emulate the most. Able to make hard decisions, hold their ground under pressure, build fast and mobilize even faster, adopt and adapt enemy technology to their advantage, and lose huge portions of their population and still keep fighting when no other civilization would, the Elysians are and always will be the true successors of Rome. Theirs is an unbroken continuity from kingdom to republic to empire to 2 empires, then back to 1, and then beyond the seas to a new and mysterious land. Though the calendar is full of holidays, Lupercalia once again stands as one of the most important of Elysian festivals, and parents still tell the story of the founding of Rome to their children, albeit in a very embellished fashion compared to the earlier days of the empire. Even those whose families came solely from the New World have ultimately come to take pride that theirs is a people who joined this great civilization, becoming part of this fascinating story over 2,000 years in the making. And thanks to the new compulsory education system, this will never be forgotten. So, to note on that education system, we have to touch on the cultural focus of feverish scholarship. While the Elysians have always been fastidious note-takers and record-keepers, their discovery of the Joseon Kingdom showed them that what they're doing, those are rookie numbers in this racket. They're gonna pump those numbers all the way up. They're falling behind. So, with the assistance of the already obsessive Joseon chroniclers across the waves, entire new doctrines of journalism and event recording enter into the Elysian culture, all but jump-starting panopticon society about 200 years before it would even be conceptualized in our own timeline. The new emperor and his Chinook wife have become the absolute object of the Elysian people's attention, and every little thing about them is aired to the common folk to show them just how the big people live their lives. Newspapers start becoming commonplace, released by the Elysian state to encourage the people and endorse a tradition of literacy and self-education. And with the introduction of the printing press into common use to facilitate those newspapers and standardized textbooks for the emperor's new compulsory education system, it is not long before an entire book craze sweeps the empire. Every record ever jotted down is compiled and printed out into hundreds or even thousands of copies, which are thereafter dispensed to every one of the several thousand imperial public libraries across the empire, so as to never be lost. Every word ever uttered by the emperor or anyone in his family is recorded and viewed by the common folk at their leisure, keeping the leaders of Elysia honest and ensuring a culture of transparency that the average citizen will simply no longer do without. In a nation this sparsely populated and spread apart, after all, the least the Imperials can do is keep the common folk up to date on the latest happenings not only in the Empire as a whole, but in the personal lives of those who pretend to know what the average homesteader is doing with themselves. And through this, enough information can reach them that graffiti and legal claims can be made to address problems in the nation, which themselves are then also recorded and copied, dispersed and dispensed for posterity. There is simply nothing that can be done to stop this trend once it takes hold. Elysian chroniclers, already so thirsty for information of any sort, have become insatiable. No article of information is too small to avoid recording. No datum too remote and dangerous to risk one's life to gather. This was the case when they came to the New World, of course. Strangers to a strange land who had to record everything they saw just to figure out the rules. But now they realize that it's more than just a good rule of thumb for living as an Elysian. It's hardwired into their very nature. Ink now flowed in their very veins, and their immediate delight at finding a culture even better at recording things than they seemed to prove the point to the entire empire that feverish scholarship was what they were meant for. And of course, all that led them to a cultural fixation to adapt and perfect. When you spend all of your time recording every variable about the world around you, and you're already inclined to cross-reference things to find out what works and what you should integrate into your own society, you end up facing off against the fact that tons of disparate information can often come together to form novel solutions to perennial problems. The Elysians, always on the lookout to find new things to use against their enemies, or for the benefit of their own people, have come to accept the fact that the amount of data they've gathered about the universe around them lends itself to completely different developments that would have never been imagined before. They have an instinctive capacity to see the potential in something before it ever comes to pass. For example, the Joseon had made a modular barreled pistol for their spies. A painfully simple thing, this preloaded barrel is held by a pair of glorified tongs and then hit with a fuse to fire off a stored arrow in the chamber. The barrel may then be discarded and a new preloaded barrel reloaded and fired in quick succession. This is something you might look at right now and throw aside as an obsolete toy made by a power that had nothing better to work with. But the Elysians see the potential of single preloaded barrels that can be quickly switched out for repeated fire. Instead of carrying around a few independent barrels and loading them quickly by hand, the Elysians have come up with an ingenious device that links together many of these modular barrels with a silk weave that holds them in a sort of, chain, if you will. This chain may then be fed into the gun via a crank, which feeds it into a flintlock device that sparks in time with the arrival of the next barrel. The barrel then fires off this chain gun, if you will, and the motion of the crank carries it out and replaces it with the next barrel, which itself is then struck and fires off its own load, and so on. While the Joseon device was fairly rudimentary, it only takes a few years for enterprising Elysian engineers to design a considerably better firearm that will feed up to 120 rounds a minute downrange and into enemy forces. Already, in the year 1605, the first taste of the chain gun has entered the greatest minds of the Elysian Empire, and this terrifying philosophy of finding an art that works even just a little bit, and then turning it into a perfected science, applies to literally everything the Elysians get their hands on. There is no device, they will insist to anyone who listens, that cannot be improved in some way. Even the most tried and true technologies have potential for advancement and update. And at least so far, there hasn't even been a single culture that the Elysians have met who doesn't have something worth adopting, adapting, and perfecting. To be Elysian is to take from others, and make whatever works that much better. Which leads us to pansyncretism. We've already repeatedly talked about how the constant adoption and adaptation of anything they find that's good has made the Elysian Empire a nation that looks exceedingly Roman to any outside observers, but upon closer inspection is consistent of parts that are all wrong. The Elysians quickly adopt and adapt any cultural or spiritual aspects that they find, or at least find useful, and so the inner workings of Elysian culture and daily life are actually quite fluid, even as the skeletal structure of the society remains nearly identical to the ancient Romans, or at least a cultural stereotype thereof. So strong is the cultural fixation on integration and syncretism, from sociology to spirituality, technology to geopolitics, that the Elysian way of life is a constantly shifting, moving, changing experience full of social competition and comprehensive dedication to a perpetual march into the future. There is not a single village in the entire world that they come across without taking something from it and incorporating it into their own society. So strenuous is their capacity to record these factors of other cultures that there are entire academic fields dedicated to the research and cross-referencing of all such documents for the continued experimentation with and adaptation of foreign practice for the advancement of the Elysian cause. Even old Native American traditions and methods are being dug out of the libraries every day to be rediscovered, reevaluated, and reintroduced back into modern society. The Elysian pantheon is a horrific hodgepodge of strange deities that have long since been lost in our own timeline, all of which have had new myths form around them to allow their integration with the exiled Hellenic and Norse gods. And none of this begins to cover matters like Elysian Latin, which is probably nothing like Latin at all anymore, and instead a monstrous amalgam of countless different languages from as far west as the Philippines and Taiwan, as far north as the Inuit, and as far south as the Fuegian people at the very bottom of the world. And their calendar, oh god, the calendar! If anyone here has ever been to New Orleans, they know that the city celebrates over twice as many festivals as there are days of the year. New Orleans, however, would be child's play compared to the calendar that the Elysians have going on. With over a dozen holidays to celebrate every day, the Elysians are quite a festive culture who have all manner of reasons to accept and work alongside each other. There's always an opportunity to invite a neighbor over for a good time. Always a party waiting to happen, and every day has over a dozen opportunities to bury the hatchet with a rival and appreciate each other for what they bring to the table. While all of this might seem chaotic, it's not exactly a fast process that has blown into existence over the Elysian culture. Over the past century and a half, all of these things have gradually made their way into the public zeitgeist and become a standard in the way Elysians live their lives. Already standing on a roaring storage economy, they never want for extra food, and there's always something that needs to be eaten before it goes bad. So neighbors, even set apart by distance as they are sure to invite people over regularly to make sure things don't go to waste. And nothing goes to waste in Elysia. Nothing. Even the rot goes to the pigs and the gators. Even the ash goes to the ink. Even the dust off the road is swept up to be put back into the public gardens. The entire society is clean, orderly, curious but respectful, ambitious but directed, and inquisitive, but restrained enough to try things in the safety of a controlled set of conditions. A sort of thoughtfulness is predominant over the entire civilization, an overwhelming need to more deeply consider things before putting them into action on a large scale, and, even at the lowest of levels, an inclination among the common folk to try new things. So long as they've been well recorded and tested, at least. In this orderly but very fluid fashion, Elysia has rooted out most of their foundational weaknesses and replaced them with new methods that only make them stronger. Perhaps it is impossible to achieve a society that has no flaws, but the Elysian Empire has made a concerted effort over the last century and a half to get as close to it as possible, and that has made them strong. So you can bet that, into the future, they'll keep this tradition very close to their hearts. And, of course, this extends not only to foreign cultures, but to the world around them. We've already discussed at length how the advent of hyper-domestication has opened the mind of the Elysian populace to the idea of committing more to animal solutions. But we have hardly touched at all on the vast explosion of plant domestication in which the empire has taken part. We mentioned last episode that things like maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and beans had become such a thing in the Elysian culture that they worked their way into its very mythology, and, of course, we've covered how the Elysian way of land management and farming is more efficient, if perhaps a bit more labor-intensive. But we really can't stress enough how, due to the sparse nature of Elysia's population, coupled with their overtly academic nature, the idea of genetics via heredity comes far faster than it did in our timeline. Elysian men, farmers at heart, are always toying around with new crops, new cultivars, new everything if at all possible. They've dedicated their entire world to making better and more fruitful harvests through the use of all of the academic knowledge the Empire has ever collected. While certain military matters are still kept as government secrets, the Emperor has maintained a strict policy of keeping all practical utilitarian advances in the public eye. Not only are smoke and steam jacks commonplace in every home, and their design available to all who are curious, but every new advancement in seed culture and domestication is public and open to all who might find interest in them. Every declaration of agrarian might may be tested by the entire community, and all husbandry methods may be swiftly put to the test by all those in the same field. A sort of early peer review process has therefore cropped up in the nation, backed by raw results and the overwhelming agrarian consensus after rigorous experimentation. Once upon a time, companion farming was mostly consistent of the Three Sisters and a few other native styles that allowed for a diverse but still fairly limited gardening culture. Now, retired Elysian military officers dedicate their twilight years to cultivating fantastic companion fields full of dozens or even hundreds of different species of food crop, all in perfect harmony with each other in a self-sustaining artificial ecosystem designed down to the very individual blade of grass in search for agrarian perfection. All people in Elysia have long since accepted that every ear of maize can be grown bigger, and with more kernels. Every bundle of skirret may be made to grow longer and fatter, every vine can be encouraged to grow stronger and more productive, and every gourd can be manipulated to dwarf the size of its parent. To the Elysian Empire, these are not mere hollow assertions. This is a truth, born out of a century and a half of hard, dedicated experimentation and the feverish recording of every individual article of data along the way. This isn't up for debate. It's not a matter of conversation or gentle consideration over the consequences. The Empire, every member within it, has the responsibility to itself to aim for the highest possible yields, the greatest possible harvest, the most productive livestock, and the most burgeoning and unwavering land fertility in the world. To do any less is to fail their own people and fall short of the legacy that has been set forth before them. Animals are getting bigger, crops are getting more fruitful, people are living longer, disease is getting less prevalent, quality of life is still rising, and whatever the Elysians get their hands on, they'll adopt, adapt, and perfect, even the plants and animals. And this is because all of their great traditions have culminated in the development of hyperdomestication, a unique fixation that has opened up the final great cultural focus of the Elysian Empire, that being the Elysian Creed. The Mustafan Wars have shown them that the old Romans are dead. Though the Elysians carry their legacy, the Empire must walk on its own and blaze its own path in this modern world. With the death of the old emperor and the integration of the Chinook High Chiefdom alongside all of the glorious discoveries from Asia and the Pacific mentioned earlier in this episode, the Elysian Creed becomes the primary national focus of the Empire as a whole. Henceforth, this national identity will be taught to all children, and all children will be required to learn at imperial public schools constructed with funds from the emperor's own purse. Those schools will not only teach the cultural history and national focus of the empire, but will also help to establish currency reform, mass standardization of weights and measures, changes in mass production, changes in foreign policy, and the encouragement of oceanic investment and infrastructural overhauls throughout the entirety of Elysian territory. Whereafter, they will be encouraged to go into the military, or some form of trade, within which they will be even further indoctrinated into the new Elysian way of life. Military standardization and service reforms allow for better equipped troops, higher combat training opportunities, and less dangerous conflict scenarios. And, taking a page from the book of the Old Roman Republic and the early Empire, the military is repurposed to embrace roles as civil engineers, power management specialists, domestic industry foremen, and architects for large projects dedicated to the common folk. It is not only a standard occurrence for a legion to wander through a small town or farm village, but all too popular for them to promptly split up into teams and refurbish the entire place overnight before leaving in the morning to perform the same feat on the next village after a hard day's march. Through this dedication to the common folk, the military understands its place not as some force of intimidation and conquest, but as a unified force of people looking out for their own and maintaining peace in the land of plenty that their forefathers have left them. Times are good, and the new emperor is, as mentioned in the last episode, a strong and charismatic leader, with a good head on his shoulders and a Chinook wife to remind him that not everyone has the heart and soul of an Elysian. At least, not just yet. But even so, no plan goes perfect in reality, and the last emperor has made several mistakes in his reforms that will cause cracks down the line. It has been over a century and a half since the Eastern Romans arrived on the shores of Cape Cod, all the while blessed with capable leaders who themselves had prepared strong and responsible heirs that cared more for the prosperity of the empire itself than for the conflict and victory to achieve the position of emperor. The imperial family has stayed a tight-knit institution of internally trusting companions and partners, seeking to maintain the emperor's personal treasury so that he can dedicate those coffers to the constant update and maintenance of the empire, and so keep the common people slavishly loyal to the Elysian cause. While there is certainly no worry for the current emperor to step out of line, he will come to father 3 children, who will reveal just how much the cracks in the foundation of this empire have begun to show. But that will have to wait until next time. As mentioned before, if you want this series to continue, we expect the last episode, Autumn and Boogaloo, to get to 250 likes. If this video gets to 250 likes, we'll put out a somewhat deeper dive into the actual daily life of Elysia, as it is around the very early 1600s. Thanks so much for coming, everybody. I hope you enjoyed what you saw here today. If you did, remember to go on down to our Patreon via that Linktree link in the description and pledge even just $1 a month to help support the cause. Join the mighty ranks of all these lovely people at the end of every single episode, and get your name in the game over on the game channel, as well as tons and tons of other stuff, like getting to vote for the next big videos on other certain channels, like Philosophy Explorers with Could They Survive 40k, and this here channel with our other alternate history settings. So, yeah, thanks a bunch, everybody, for coming. Hope you stay safe, stay inside, stay healthy, and, of course, remember to help each other. Vote progressive, vote Bull Moose.